Your 15 years are over, Arthur. Pack your things and get off my property, Ryan Blackwood sneered, sliding the separation agreement across the table. Bradley Cole smirked. I did not argue. I signed my name, packed my things, and revoked the proprietary seasoning supply. You're out, Arthur. Your 15 years are over. Pack your things and get off my property, Ryan Blackwood sneered, sliding the thick manila termination folder across the polished glass conference table. His newly hired chief operating officer, Bradley Cole, smirked beside him, casually checking his gold Rolex. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting flat on the table, feeling the coldness of the glass. It was Friday, exactly 4:30 p.m. I looked down at the signature line on the separation agreement. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply picked up my Mont Blanc pen, signed my name in clean, deliberate strokes, and walked out. Ryan thought he had just won the ultimate victory. He thought he was taking complete control of the fast casual burger franchise we had spent 15 years building. What he didn't know, and what his high-priced corporate lawyers had failed to notice, was that the very seasoning that made our signature burgers famous was owned by my independent holding company, and the supply agreement had a continuity clause he hadn't bothered to read. In 2011, Richard Blackwood and I started Burger and Barrel. We began with a single, drafty storefront in downtown Columbus, Ohio, working 18-hour shifts. Richard had the business mind and the initial capital, while I had the culinary background and the operational grit. I spent months in my home kitchen perfecting the Barrel seasoning, a proprietary blend of smoked Hungarian paprika, toasted mustard seed, garlic powder, and 3 secret botanical spices that gave our fresh beef patties their unique, smoky caramelized crusts when seared on a flat-top grill. That seasoning was the foundation of our brand. It was what set us apart from every other fast-casual joint in the Midwest, creating an addictive flavor profile that kept customers coming back. Within 5 years, we had opened 10 corporate locations, and the lines were always wrapped around the block. That was when we decided to franchise. We established a strict, highly detailed operational model. To maintain absolute quality, every single franchisee had to buy their ingredients and proprietary seasoning directly from our approved supply chain partners. I insisted on establishing a separate entity, Pendleton Flavor Labs LLC, to hold the intellectual property, patents, and manufacturing rights for the seasoning blend. I leased the trademark to our parent company, Burger and Barrel Corp., but kept the flavor formulas and the blending facility under my personal control. Richard agreed without hesitation, knowing that my dedication to the food quality was what drove our success. It was a fair, balanced partnership based on mutual trust. For years, the partnership was flawless. Richard handled the franchise expansion, legal compliance, and real estate acquisition, while I managed day-to-day operations, quality control, and the supply chain. We grew to 110 locations across the Midwest. Our network revenue reached $95 million annually, with the parent company bringing in $12 million in royalties and supply fees. The system was running like clockwork, and our franchisees were thriving, making decent profits and building local community relationships. Then, 3 years ago, Richard passed away from a sudden heart attack. His 60% majority share of the company went to his son, Ryan Blackwood. Ryan was 35, had an Ivy League MBA, and was obsessed with private equity exits. He had never worked a single shift in a restaurant, never scraped a grease trap, and never spoken to a franchise owner. To him, Burger and Barrel was not a restaurant chain. It was a spreadsheet with costs to be cut and multiples to be optimized. Ryan wanted a massive exit. He began quiet talks with Apex Brands, a massive food service conglomerate, for a buyout valued at $150 million. Under the proposed merger, my 25% founder's equity would be worth $37.5 million. But Ryan didn't want to share the payout. He wanted to squeeze every dollar out of the transaction. He hired Bradley Cole as the new COO. Bradley was a ruthless corporate liquidator who specialized in stripping legacy brands of their quality to boost short-term numbers. Together, they started freezing me out of board meetings, ignoring my emails, and altering operational strategies without my consent. They wanted to maximize EBITDA to pump the merger valuation. Bradley's first proposal was to replace our fresh, locally sourced beef with cheap, pre-frozen utility-grade patties, and to swap our proprietary barrel seasoning with a cheap, chemical-based imitation sourced from a bulk vendor in China. I refused. I pointed out that the franchise agreements explicitly guaranteed our quality standards and that our customers would instantly taste the difference. Ryan laughed it off, telling me that the modern consumer didn't care about taste, only price. The tension in the office became unbearable. I knew they were planning to oust me. I saw the signs, the whispering in the hallways, the sudden audit of my department, the restriction of my access to the corporate servers. But I didn't panic. I knew something they didn't. I had my lawyers review the original supply agreements between Burger and Barrel Corp. And Pendleton Flavor Labs, LLC. The agreement contained Clause 14.2, a keyman continuity provision. It stated that if I, Arthur Pendleton, was terminated or ceased to hold an executive position at the parent company, the supply agreement would immediately enter a 72-hour sunset period, after which it would be fully terminated, and Pendleton Flavor Labs would have no further obligation to supply the seasoning. Ryan and Bradley were so focused on ousting me that they never reviewed the supply contracts. They thought the seasoning was just another line item expense they could easily replace. They didn't realize it was the lock that kept the entire franchise empire together. And I was the only one with the key. The tension reached its boiling point during our monthly operational meeting in mid-October. Bradley Cole sat at the end of the long mahogany table, tapping his titanium pen against a thick stack of financial spreadsheets. He didn't look at me as he spoke. He was presenting his new cost-cutting initiative, which he called the Quality Optimization Initiative. It was a classic corporate euphemism for buying cheap garbage and selling it at a premium. "We have sourced a new spice supplier based in Shanghai," Bradley announced, his voice flat and monotonous. "They can replicate the taste profile of our seasoning at a 75% cost reduction. This will add approximately $8 million to our bottom line annually, which directly increases our valuation for the Apex Brands merger." I leaned forward, placing my elbows on the table. "Have you run taste tests, Bradley? Have you run chemical analysis? The barrel seasoning is a proprietary blend. It has no artificial preservatives. What you are proposing is a chemical cocktail loaded with monosodium glutamate, silicon dioxide anti-caking agents, and artificial smoke flavorings. It will ruin the flavor profile of our food and cause the beef's moisture retention to fail on the flat-top grills, resulting in dry, burnt patties." Ryan Blackwood chimed in, his tone dripping with condescension. "Arthur, we are running a national business, not a local culinary school. The deal with Shanghai is already drafted. We need you to sign off on the supplier transition next week so we can update our franchise disclosure document." "I won't sign it," I said calmly. "Under the quality standards of our franchise agreement, I have sole authority over supply chain approval. I will not authorize a change that violates our quality promise to our franchisees and customers." Ryan's face flushed red, his jaw clenching. He looked at Bradley, who gave a slight nod. I knew then that the trap was set. They had been waiting for this exact refusal. They wanted to build a case that I was actively sabotaging the company's financial growth and blocking vendor negotiations, which they could claim was a breach of my fiduciary duties as an officer of the corporation. Over the next 3 days, the corporate office became a ghost town for me. My assistant was reassigned, my calendar was cleared. I received a formal notice that the board was conducting an internal investigation into my operational mismanagement and obstruction of company growth. They accused me of misappropriating company funds because I had authorized our regular monthly payments to our local spice growers in Oregon. Growers we had contracted with for over a decade to supply our premium paprika and mustard seed. It was a clumsy frame job, but they didn't need a real case. They just needed a pretext to fire me before the merger negotiations finalized. On Friday at 4:30 p.m., Ryan's assistant called me into the executive boardroom. The air conditioning was humming, making the room feel like a meat locker. Ryan sat at the head of the table. Bradley was next to him, and a corporate lawyer from Vanguard Capital sat on the other side. "Arthur, we've reviewed the findings of the internal audit," the lawyer began, sliding a heavy blue folder toward me. "Your refusal to cooperate with the board's cost-saving measures, combined with your unauthorized payments to Oregon spice vendors, constitutes a breach of your employment contract. We have grounds for termination for cause. Which means, Ryan interrupted, leaning forward with a smug smile, we can reclaim your 25% founder's shares at book value. That's about $5 million. But we're willing to be generous. If you sign this voluntary separation agreement today, we will buy your shares for $5 million, and we won't pursue legal action against you. $5 million. They were trying to rob me of $32.5 million. They thought I would be intimidated by the threat of a lawsuit. They thought I would scramble to protect whatever payout I could get. I looked at the separation agreement. I looked at Ryan. He was his father's son in appearance, but he had none of Richard's honor. He was just a small man chasing a big check, completely detached from the operational reality of the business. Let me get this straight, I said. You are terminating my employment as Executive Vice President of Operations, effective immediately? Yes, Ryan said. You're out, Arthur. Your 15 years are over. Pack your things and get off my property. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I took my pen from my pocket and signed the agreement. I didn't need their $5 million. I had the kill switch. I'll have my personal items cleared out by 5 p.m., I said, standing up. Bradley smirked. Ryan shook the lawyer's hand. They thought they had just secured the easiest $32 million of their lives. They had no idea they had just cut the rope, holding up their entire corporate scaffold. I walked out of the corporate headquarters carrying a single box of my personal belongings. The security guard, a man named Marcus, whom I had hired 10 years ago, looked down at the floor, unable to meet my eye. I patted him on the shoulder. Don't worry about it, Marcus. Enjoy the weekend. I got into my truck and drove straight to the offices of Pendleton Flavor Labs, LLC. The lab was located in a modest industrial park 15 miles west of the corporate headquarters. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. It contained our proprietary mixing machinery, our spice inventory, and the secure server that housed our formulas. I sat at my desk and pulled up the supply agreement between Pendleton Flavor Labs and Burger and Barrel Corp. I flipped to page 14, section 14.2. Keyman continuity. The language was precise. It had been drafted by my personal attorney, David Vance, a veteran franchise lawyer who understood how corporate takeovers worked. The clause stated, "This supply agreement is predicated on the active executive employment of Arthur Pendleton within Burger and Barrel Corp. In the event that Arthur Pendleton's executive employment is terminated for any reason, or if he ceases to hold a position with operational authority over quality control, this agreement shall enter a 72-hour sunset period. Upon expiration of the sunset period, this agreement shall terminate automatically, and Pendleton Flavor Labs LLC shall have no obligation to manufacture, supply, or deliver the barrel seasoning to Burger and Barrel Corp. Or any of its designated distributors." I called David. He answered on the second ring. "Arthur, how did it go?" "They fired me, David, just as we expected. They offered $5 million for my equity under threat of a lawsuit, and I signed the separation agreement." David let out a low whistle. "They really didn't read the supply contract, did they?" "They didn't. They were too busy looking at the EBITDA projections for the Shanghai deal. I need you to draft the formal termination notice for the supply agreement." "I'll have it ready in 10 minutes, David said. "Who should I copy?" "Send it to Ryan Bradley, the entire board of Burger and Barrel Corp., and make sure you copy the lead M&A counsel at Apex Brands. I want them to have it before their weekend meetings." I hung up and logged into our inventory management system. We had 3 shipments of barrel seasonings scheduled to go out on Monday morning to the regional distribution hubs that supplied our 110 franchise locations. I canceled the shipments. I locked down the system, revoked the API keys that connected our lab's shipping database to the corporate logistics network, and set an automated message on our client portal. "Service suspended, contract terminated." At 5:15 p.m., David sent the emails. The subject line was simple: "Notice of termination of supply agreement, Pendleton Flavor Labs." I shut down my computer, locked the office door, and walked out. I turned off my phone. I had spent 15 years working 80-hour weeks, managing supply lines, dealing with angry health inspectors, and ensuring our franchisees had everything they needed to succeed. I was tired. I was going to spend the weekend fishing at my cabin on the Scioto River. I knew exactly what would happen next. The franchise system of Burger and Barrel was built on consistency. Every franchisee signed a strict quality control agreement. Section 9.4 of the franchise agreement stated that franchisees could only use approved ingredients and proprietary supplies. The use of unauthorized seasoning was a material breach that could result in the immediate revocation of their franchise license. But the franchise agreement also placed a reciprocal obligation on the parent company. They were legally required to provide a steady, uninterrupted supply of proprietary ingredients. By firing me and triggering the termination of the seasoning contract, Ryan and Bradley had made it impossible for the parent company to fulfill its obligations. They had locked 110 restaurant owners out of the system. By Monday morning, the seasoning at the individual stores would start running low. By Tuesday, they would be completely out. And without the seasoning, they couldn't sell a single burger. Without violating their contracts or serving substandard food, the fuse was lit. I got into my truck and drove toward the river, leaving the corporate storm behind. I spent Saturday and Sunday on the river, completely disconnected from the world. No phone, no emails, no corporate updates, just the cold water and the quiet woods. It was the first time in 15 years I felt truly at peace, away from the endless noise of spreadsheets and board meetings. On Monday morning at 8:00 a.m., I drove back to Columbus, pulled into a local diner, and turned my phone back on. The screen instantly lit up with a barrage of alerts. I had 82 missed calls, 46 voicemails, and over 200 unread emails. I ordered a cup of black coffee and a plate of eggs and began scanning the messages. The first dozen voicemails were from Ryan Blackwood, sent late Friday evening. His voice progressed from arrogant disbelief to cold fury. "Arthur, what is this nonsense your lawyer sent? You can't terminate the supply agreement. We have a contract. Turn the shipping portal back on immediately. This is corporate sabotage, and we will sue you for every penny you have." By Saturday afternoon, his tone had shifted. The anger was replaced by a slight edge of panic. "Arthur, pick up the phone. We need to resolve this. We have the Apex M&A audit team in our office right now. We can negotiate a transition period. Let's talk." The voicemails from Monday morning were pure desperation. "Arthur, please. The franchisees are refusing to open. They are calling the corporate office. The regional distributors are refusing to accept our meat deliveries because they don't have the seasoning. We are bleeding money. Call me back." I didn't call him back. Instead, I called Sarah Jenkins, one of our oldest franchise owners. She owned 6 highly profitable locations in Ohio and was the president of the Franchise Advisory Council. "Arthur," Sarah exclaimed when she answered. "Thank God you called. What is going on? We received an email from your lab saying the seasoning supply is terminated. Corporate sent us a memo telling us to use a generic seasoning blend from their local distributor until further notice, but our contract says we can only use barrel seasoning." "It's simple, Sarah," I explained calmly. "Ryan and Bradley terminated my contract on Friday. That termination automatically triggered the end of the supply agreement with Pendleton Flavor Labs. The corporate office has no legal right to manufacture or distribute my proprietary blend. And if you use the generic stuff they are pushing, you are violating the quality standards of the brand, and your customers will know." Sarah was silent for a moment. "They're trying to push cheap ingredients to make the company look better for the merger, aren't they?" "Yes," I said. "They wanted to cut costs by 75% on the seasoning and switch to frozen meat. They fired me because I refused to sign off on it." "Those idiots," Sarah hissed. "They are going to ruin the brand we spent 15 years building. I've already talked to 20 other owners. We're not serving generic garbage. We've hired a franchise litigation firm. We are filing a class action lawsuit against the corporate office for breach of contract and failure to supply proprietary goods. We're shutting down our stores until the original quality standards are restored. That is your right under Section 12 of the franchise agreement," I said. "I'll support you in any way I can." By noon, the shutdown was in full effect. Over 80 franchise locations across Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan refused to open their doors. The front windows of the restaurants bore signs that read, "Closed due. Supply chain failure." The financial damage was catastrophic. Burger and Barrel Corp was losing approximately $300,000 a day in lost royalties and supply margins. But the real damage was to the merger. David called me at 1 p.m. "Arthur, I just got off a call with the legal counsel at Apex Brands. They are furious. They've sent a formal notice to Vanguard Capital freezing the merger negotiations. They've stated that if the operational shutdown isn't resolved and the franchisee lawsuits aren't dropped within 48 hours, they are pulling out of the $150 million acquisition entirely." Vanguard Capital's investment was suddenly on the line. If the merger collapsed, Burger and Barrel Corp would be buried under lawsuits from angry franchisees, and the brand's reputation would be permanently destroyed. The company's valuation would drop to zero. Ryan and Bradley had tried to steal my $32 million. Now, they were about to lose everything. On Tuesday morning, David and I walked into the executive boardroom at the corporate headquarters. The atmosphere was very different from Friday. Ryan Blackwood looked 10 years older. His tie was loosened, his sleeves were rolled up, and there were dark circles under his eyes. Bradley Cole sat next to him, staring blankly at a legal pad. Two representatives from Vanguard Capital, the private equity firm that held the majority stake in the parent company, sat at the table. Their lead partner, a sharp-faced woman named Victoria Vance, didn't even look at Ryan as we walked in. She kept her focus entirely on me. "Arthur," Victoria said, her voice like ice, "thank you for coming. We need to resolve this dispute immediately. The Apex merger is on the verge of cancellation. The franchisees have filed a class action lawsuit in federal court. We are losing $500,000 a day. What are your terms?" I sat down and opened my briefcase. I didn't look at Ryan, who was glaring at me with silent fury. "My terms are simple," I said, sliding a 3-page document across the table. "First, Pendleton Flavor Labs will sell the proprietary formulas and all manufacturing rights for the barrel seasoning to Burger and Barrel Corp. for a one-time payment of $40 million. This will ensure the corporation has permanent, unrestricted access to the seasoning." Ryan gasped. $40 million, that's extortion. The entire value of the lab is— "Silence, Ryan," Victoria snapped. She turned back to me. "Go on second," I continued. "My 25% founder's equity stake must be fully restored and protected. I will receive my full $37.5 million payout upon the closing of the Apex Brands merger. The separation agreement I signed on Friday, which valued my shares at $5 million, is void due to material omission of the supply agreement's termination consequences." Bradley Cole looked up, his voice shaking. "We can't do that. That would reduce Vanguard's exit payout by—" "You should have read the supply contract, Bradley," I said. "Your ignorance is not my financial concern. And third," I concluded, "Ryan Blackwood and Bradley Cole must resign from their positions immediately. They will receive no severance, no stock options, and no bonuses from the Apex merger. Their mismanagement has endangered the company and violated the trust of our franchisees. I want them out of the building today." Ryan stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You can't do this. This is my father's company. You're ousting me." "Your father built this company on quality and partnership, Ryan," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "You tried to turn it into a cheap spreadsheet and rob the man who helped him build it. You did this to yourself." Victoria Vance stood up and looked at Ryan. "Pack your office. Ryan, Bradley, you too. We will sign the agreement." "Victoria." "You can't." Ryan started. "If the Apex merger collapses, our fund loses $90 million, Victoria said coldly. "Your incompetence has cost us enough. Sign the papers and get out." The signatures were finalized by 2 p.m. Ryan and Bradley left the building in silence, carrying their belongings in cardboard boxes, with no security escort needed. They were radioactive in the industry. The story of how an arrogant heir almost destroyed a $150 million brand because he failed to read a supply agreement would follow them for the rest of their careers. As soon as the contract was signed and the $40 million wire transfer cleared into Pendleton Flavor Labs' account, I reactivated the shipping portal. I called Sarah Jenkins and told her the seasoning was on its way and that the original quality standards were legally guaranteed. By Wednesday morning, the franchise locations were open, the grills were hot, and the smell of fresh beef and barrel seasoning was in the air. The merger with Apex Brands closed 2 weeks later. My total payout, between the sale of the seasoning rights and my restored equity, was $77.5 million. I didn't buy a yacht or a corporate jet. I bought a 2,000-acre ranch in the Montana mountains. I spend my days fly fishing, hiking, and watching the sun set over the peaks. Occasionally, I consult for young founders who are taking on private equity, teaching them the most important lesson I learned in my 30 years in the business. When the corporate sharks circle, don't try to outrun them. Just quietly control the food source. It's funny looking back. Ryan thought he was a master of corporate chess. He thought the board was made of stock options, board seats, and executive titles. He never realized that the real board was the operational code, the seasoning, the actual lifeblood of the company. He thought he could fire the founder and keep the company. Instead, he fired himself and bought me a mountain. Da Viet Huan Ching, Da Viet Huan Ching.